Overoptimization is kind of a word that describes maybe the dark side or the negative side effects of optimizing yourself and trying to optimize yourself. Maybe your heart rate variability, maybe your nutrition, to just make it a little bit better, and maybe also sport, maybe also not focus, but work, and maybe also your relationships. But over-optimization is something that doesn't really make sense, because the optimization itself is to find the optimal point. It's basically a mathematical definition, and if you have a problem and it's two-dimensional, then you can find a point which has maybe the highest value, if this is the value and this is a certain variable. This now means if you have maybe a peak in here, of course this doesn't mean there couldn't be a peak down there, down 20 meters from here, if this is just a normal graph. But what it means that what the process of optimization means is to find the optimal point that works for you. This could mean, for example, if you want to spend more time with family, if you want to spend less time with family, or you cannot spend as much time with family, or you want to work more, you want to work out more in order to maybe get into the best shape of your life. What it all comes down to, I think, is optimization. Optimization is the all-encompassing phrase or word that basically includes all of these different things. And then there might be a critic that says, yeah, but you didn't consider this. So now let's discuss what this critique is actually about. If the optimization is a function, and this function has an outcome, and this outcome is probably your life's value overall, probably over all of the years. Because let's face it, if you enjoy yourself more these days, with food for example, then you will pay for it later on in your life. So therefore, I think it makes sense to take the whole life and basically see how much utility you get out of the life. You could also say enjoyment you get out of the life. You could also say other words that have a similar meaning to you, but actually it's just about finding the optimal, the maximum point. Now, if you have on the one side of this equation the best outcome, on the other side of the equation you have the variables and their cofactors. This means how important these variables are. Then somebody else comes along and says, yeah, but you didn't think about family. You also didn't think about health yet. You also didn't think about this yet. And I heard this quote by Jeff Bezos that said, it's all nothing because, I don't know, life is just about being happy. These quotes are simplifying reality far too much because they concentrate usually on two variables. And often used quote construction is, it's not about working hard, but about playing hard. Even though this is not a very useful quote, but it could also be, if you work hard, you can also play hard, and just things like these. They compare two different variables and their importance, basically their cofactors, and then just try to determine which one is more important. And because it is so short and because it is so pregnant, you could say, even though I don't know, that's not a word. It's actually a word in other languages, but in English it has the connotation of being pregnant. So therefore it's a very, not decisive, but it is very short, and therefore a very memorable phrase or word. So therefore, if you then compare these two variables and say work is much more important than life, or living is the only thing that is more important, or it's actually life is not about working, it's about enjoying the things you have. It's almost always comparing these two variables and just saying the one is less important, but the other one is more important. And this function we are discussing, this optimization function of the life, is a multivariate function. This means it has many different variables. And even though some variables might have a very small impact, so basically a very small importance, basically a very small cofactor, if you think about the cofactor in terms of the cofactor maximum, the maximum impact a variable can have is basically 100%, and then you can reduce it. So let's just see it in time. A day, for example, has 24 hours. If you now wanted to optimize the day, if you just looked at the time, you could say, for 1/4 or for 1/3 of the day, I actually sleep. So therefore, the sleep has an importance of 1/3 or 33%. Then you could also distribute or try to get the right proportions for the rest of the time. So therefore you could say, I want to do 1 hour of sport, which is 1/24 of my daily time. And now what this function tells you is that you can basically determine the different cofactors of these variables. And it's trying to find the optimum is basically trying to play with these cofactors, because the variables exist without you doing anything. Of course, you can try to reduce certain variables, like maybe not starting a family and therefore reducing family down to your parents basically and your relatives you already had, but you don't have a family of your own that is your own offspring. So what these people criticizing the over-optimization of life, I think, get wrong is they just take what they get wrong is basically that optimization is the function that encompasses already everything. And now if a person comes along and says, yeah, but this variable isn't included, that's maybe a valid point. But usually what someone tries to do is then to overthrow the whole function. But that's not the right approach. It's also not a very scientific approach. The right approach is to take the existing model, which is the function, and then try to improve upon it. Just with Albert Einstein's relativity theory, for example, we now recently, a few years ago, discovered, not we, but humans, or rather scientists, very top-notch scientists, not me, discovered basically gravity waves. And what this means is that Einstein partially was right, but Einstein maybe was also wrong in other theories or in other parts of his model. And of course you could say Einstein was wrong and then that's about it, and Einstein was wrong in everything, but I think that's just a very simplified approach, first of all to people, second of all to models, and third of all to life, to say just because there is one negative point that means everything is wrong. But in terms of the psychology of perceiving people, I think this is often how it works. If one person has a counter argument against another person, then it looks maybe a little bit good on a stage, for example, or in any interaction, and it looks like the one person now has won this argument, then, well, that's kind of the downside of the social interaction through speech and through body communication and through other parts of communication. So what I'm trying to say is, it doesn't make sense to overthrow the function entirely. What makes sense is to try to use the existing model that has worked well so far, and there is also this saying that if something works, then just don't try to overthrow it. If you have, so I don't know if this is a saying also in English, but if you have a winning team, just don't change it. And now if we want to change it, then the idea is not to overthrow the whole function you already built up, which is your current state of living when it comes to the life optimization function. Your life optimization function already has a certain outcome. And if you also include it over time, over the years, then if you, for example, are currently, health is a very nice example because it has very established scientific effects, and therefore you can use it, and it's also something you can influence, and it is something you can actually influence, whereas your genes, for example, you're kind of given fixed intelligence, at least by the part that is provided by your genetics, is also something that is relatively fixed. So now, if we take this function and try to optimize it, you already have an outcome. And the optimization process is not to overthrow everything you currently already know about your life, but the optimization and maybe the over-optimization, which cannot really exist because, as I said, it already includes the different variables. And if somebody critiques this whole thing, then just add another variable. And that's the whole point. Over-optimization doesn't really exist. The same is true. So over-optimization in itself, because optimization is defined as finding the optimal point. But there, of course, are other similar descriptions, such as overthinking something. Of course, you can overthink something. And overthinking something is basically the balance between acting and planning. Somebody who impulsively acts all the time could be called an animal, because that's kind of what animals do. But we have a system too. We have an additional system, and that's kind of the neocortex, and we can actually try to influence these decisions, even though there seems to be some evidence that this is actually not really free will, but rather something that is just a feeling of free will, but this is an entirely different topic. And I think it makes sense to use this, and therefore on the balancing point, on the spectrum of overthinking something, overthinking, this is also something that's, I think, very interesting. The only thing you have to do in order to create truisms, so basically truisms, statements that are usually always true, or in most cases true, is to use a word and then to have a negative connotation to it. Overthinking is bad. Yes, it is. Why? Because it's overthinking. It's defined as bad because it's overdoing a thing. And I think that's the end.